Welcome to our second example problem video for this course. Let's jump right in. In this video, I'm going to be going over how to work through problems that require you to use the quotient rule. Now, like in the previous video, which covered the product rule, the first and most important thing for us to do before we get started is to actually write out what the quotient rule tells us. Now, the quotient rule involves finding derivatives of cases where you have one function, let's call it f of x, which is being divided by a second function, which we'll call g of x. The quotient rule tells us that if you're taking the derivative of f of x divided by g of x, then you will have the following. First off, in the numerator, you will have the derivative of f prime of x, times g of x, minus the derivative of g of x, g prime of x, times f of x. That's it for the numerator. In the denominator, you will simply have g of x squared. Okay, in other words, what the quotient rule tells us is that if you are taking the derivative of one function in the top divided by another function in the bottom, then this is equal to the derivative of the top times the bottom minus the derivative of the bottom times the top, all divided by the bottom function squared. Okay, as before, I'm going to leave this up here for the remainder of this video. Alright, let's jump right in with a quote-unquote easy problem. Again, whenever I work through what I call an easy problem, that means that these are straightforward problems that are only intended to illustrate how the methodology or the techniques are supposed to be used. There won't be any twists or anything particularly complicated in the easy case. So let's say I asked you guys to find the derivative of the function e to the x divided by the function natural log of x. Okay. So the first step, like in the previous video, is to figure out how do we determine that we need to use the quotient rule in this problem. Now, quotient rule problems are usually pretty straightforward to figure out. You can usually tell that you need a quotient rule, or that you need to use the quotient rule, because you can see that there is a large fraction with a function on the top and another function on the bottom. I'm going to use the same color scheme that I used in the previous video, and call this top function, which is e to the x, I'll call that f of x, which is the function in blue. And the bottom function, which we're calling g of x, I will have be the function in green. And just like in the previous video, the very first thing that you should do is to write these down. So write down our function f of x is e to the x, and our function g of x in green is natural log of x. All right. Now again, just like in the previous video, the very first thing that you should do, right after having written these down, is to also write down their derivatives. Now if f of x is equal to e to the x, then by the exponential rule, we know that f prime of x is also equal to e to the x. Next, if g of x is equal to natural log of x, then we know by the log rule that g prime of x, its derivative, is going to be 1 over x. All right, next off, rewrite the rule that you are working with. So we see that here we are in the case of finding the derivative of one function in the top divided by another function in the bottom. This requires us to use quotient rule, which tells us that this is equal to f prime of x times g of x minus g prime of x times f of x. And all of this divided by g of x squared. All right. As before, I'm going to color code each of these so you can see where everything needs to go. We see that as for our function in blue, f of x, it shows up over here. Our function in green, g of x, shows up here, but also down here. Then our function in green, f prime of x, shows up here. And our function in yellow, g prime of x, shows up here. Okay, we're almost done. The only thing that's left for us to do is to rewrite everything in this formula, but plugging in the functions that we have written over here on the side. First up is our function in red, which we have said is e to the x. We're multiplying this function by the function in green, which is natural log of x. Next up, we have a minus sign, followed by our function in yellow, which is 1 over x, times our function in blue, which is e to the x. All of this is being divided by, in parentheses, our function in green, which is natural log of x, and all of this is squared. And we are done. Okay, so once again, the quotient rule, even though it looks, and certainly is in a sense, a little bit, shall we say, uglier or maybe nastier looking than the product rule, the process is still going to be relatively the same difficulty as long as you do all of your good bookkeeping and write everything out first, then plug them in the right spot. It's not much more difficult. Just keep track of all of your derivatives and all of the functions you're working with, then rewrite the rule out completely and plug everything in the spot that it needs to go. Okay, that was an easy problem. Let's tackle a problem that's going to be perhaps a little bit more difficult. So this is going to be a harder problem. Let's say I asked you guys to find the derivative of, let's say I have 7x squared minus 2x plus 3 in the numerator. And in the denominator, I have square root of x plus 2e to the x. Okay. This function definitely looks a little bit tougher than our easy example. But remember, the steps that you need to follow in these types of problems are always going to be the same. First things first, we identify that we need to use the quotient rule because we have this function in the top in blue that is being divided by this function in the bottom that is in green. And let's go ahead and write those out. So in blue we have our function f of x, which is equal to 7x squared minus 2x plus 3. And in green we have our function g of x, which is equal to square root of x plus 2e to the x. All right, remember, the next step, always the very first thing you need to do at this point, is to now write out the derivatives of these two functions. If f of x is equal to 7x squared minus 2x plus 3, then its derivative f prime of x is going to be 14x minus 2. We know this by using the power rule. All right, next up, we have the derivative of our function g. Now, if g of x is equal to the square root of x plus 2e to the x, then we know that its derivative g prime of x is going to be 1/2 x to the negative 1/2 plus 2e to the x. This one might not be super obvious to you guys right away. If you don't see this, then I suggest that you practice some of the derivative problems from a previous homework set that I assigned. All you need to use for this guy is over here. This is a power rule. And over here, this is just an exponential rule. Okay. Now that we have all these functions written out, the next thing that we want to do is to write out again in full the formula for the quotient rule. So we're being asked to find the derivative of a function in the top divided by a function in the bottom. And the quotient rule tells us that this is going to be the derivative of the top times the bottom minus the derivative of the bottom times the top. All this divided by the bottom function squared. All right. Once again, let's color code all of these so we know where everything goes. Our function f of x is the function in blue, and it goes over here. Our function in green is g of x. It shows up in the bottom and also over here in the top. Our function in red is the function f prime of x, which shows up here in the top. And last but not least, our function in yellow is the function g prime of x, which shows up there in top. All right, the only thing we have left to do now is to rewrite this by plugging in all of the functions we have written down. First off is the function f prime of x in red, which we have written down as being equal to 14x minus 2. This is being multiplied by our function in green, which is equal to the square root of x plus 2e to the x. Next off, we have a minus sign. Then we have our function in yellow, which is equal to 1/2 x to the negative 1/2 plus 2e to the x. And last but not least, let's make this a little bit smaller. Give myself a little bit more space. Last but not least, we have our function f of x, which is equal to 7x squared minus 2x plus 3. All right. That's it for the numerator. Let's now look at the denominator. In the denominator, we always have a function that is being squared, and that function is the function in green. We have written out that the function in green is equal to square root of x plus 2e to the x. And we are done. Okay. Once again, these types of problems are not all that difficult as long as you do your due diligence. Practice proper bookkeeping, write down all the functions you're working with, then write down their derivatives, then write down the full formula of the rule that you need to use. If you do those three things, all that's left in the last step is to plug everything in the right spot, and again, make sure that you put your parentheses in the right place. All right. As usual, let me know if you have any questions, but otherwise, that's it for the quotient rule. Bye-bye.